So last week, we talked about seasons, how some seasons begin and some seasons come to an end. We talked about how some seasons are intentional and some that we have control, and some, like the weather, we have no control over. And we decided as a church that we would enter into a season together of prayer and fasting. This is a core discipline of our faith and is good to do on our own as well as corporately. And I'm glad that you're taking the time to join us in this as a church together. See, but is fasting just a ritual that we do? Is it just a practice that we do with no reason to do it other than the ritual behind it? Well, of course not. We talked about this question last week in Isaiah 58, 1-5, where Brandon talked about that very question. Today, we're going to answer that question, which of course is no, and we're going to look into why we fast and what we fast over, and what results from our fasting. And so, if you look here, we're going to read through Isaiah 58, verses 6-10. It says, "Is this not the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh. Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, Here I am. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger, and speaking wickedness, if you pour yourself out for the hungry, and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in the darkness, and your gloom shall be as the noonday." We can notice a pattern here. Look in verses 6 and 7, it starts with, "Is not this, and is it not?" Look in verse 8 and verse 9, it says, "Then shall, and then you shall." And then look halfway through verse 9 and verse 10, it says, "If you, and if you." We see this pattern of is not, and then shall, and if you. So we start first, we're going to take this section by section with is not this. And again, back in verse 6, "Is not this the fast that I choose?" Well, what is that? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke. You see, fasting is not simply abstaining from food. We also abstain from wickedness. We push aside the sins and the wickedness that we are part of, and we instead choose righteousness. We do this in our personal lives, but as we go on, to let the oppressed go free and to break every yoke, we also do this socially. That not only do our personal lives improve, not only do we push the sin away from ourselves, but we push the sin away from our community. That we as believers, as a church, get together and we say, what is evil among us? Let's get rid of it. We continue in verse 7. It says, "Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him." Now we see a turn. It's not just removing wickedness from our midst, but now we're going a step further. Now we are going and actively seeking good, because this is what righteousness is. Righteousness is not simply pushing away sin and trying to avoid sin. No, it's actively pursuing what is good. If we do that, the sin will minimize, but the good will be maximized. So we do this for our community, but it goes on and it says not to hide yourself from your own flesh. Well, what does this mean? Well, it's reminding us that as we focus on our community and focus on ourselves, not to forget our household. If you're a parent, do not neglect your children. If you're a spouse, do not neglect your husband or your wife. If you're a child, do not neglect your brothers, your sisters, and your parents. If you are single, do not neglect your own home and your own body. Make sure you take care of your household. Make sure you take care of your own personal life. And make sure then you take care and do good for the society around you. Well, what do we get when we do this? And the Bible gives us a reward for doing such things. It says in verse 8, "Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. We see this amazing picture of a past, a present, and a future. First, the present, your light shall break forth like the dawn. All of a sudden, our present becomes brighter and greater as the light of the world shines his favor on us. Then we see our past. Your healing shall spring up speedily. Those scars from past seasons, those wounds that we've had. Suddenly, God starts to quickly and speedily, it says, speed them up. We become healed. And then our future. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. So now our righteousness, as we remove sin and pursue good, protects us going into the future. And God is our protection that we don't slide back. There's this beautiful picture of a brighter present, a dimmer and healed past, and a protected future. We go to verse 9. It says, then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, here I am. I have a question for you. Do you think God is far from you? Does it feel like God might be? I'll say this is a reason we fast. That as we abstain from eating and abstain from wickedness and pursue good and righteousness, we draw near to God. And James 4:8 says, those who draw near to God, he draws near to as well. We see this too. It gives a qualifier. There is things that we must do in order for these good things to happen. And so it talks about this in the second half of verse 9 and verse 10. It says, if, qualifies it with, if you take away the yoke from your midst and the pointing of your finger and speaking wickedness. It reiterates exactly what it said in verse 6 with deal with the personal sin. Get rid of the personal wickedness in your life if you want these great things. Verse 10, if you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted. Again, now we see the shift from personal to societal. We've dealt with ourselves, now we deal with society. We purge the cultural sin that we might be taking part of, and we actively pursue good to make this a better place, to show the light of Jesus and be more like him. And again, at the very end, it wraps it up with saying, if you do these things, then shall your light rise in the darkness, and your gloom be as the noonday. Restating that our present now becomes brighter as we go into the future, more righteous and closer with God. So I'll close by saying this, that fasting is really feasting, just of a different kind. As we get away from the distraction that food can sometimes be, as we plan our breakfast, lunch, and dinner, instead we replace it with chewing and feasting on the Word of God and on righteousness, on correcting past sins and pursuing God's glory, not just personally, but societally as well. And then we're told that we reap all of these benefits. So as we fast today, we are feasting. But the question for you, church, is what are you feasting on today?